Rain poured over the cobbled streets of London like a sentence passed by heaven itself. Beneath the trembling gas lamps, the night markets swelled with shouts, carriages, and the clatter of coins. The scent of wet hay and smoke mixed with fear, because tonight souls would be sold. Among them stood Ilara Wynne, a girl barely 22, dressed in the tattered remains of her late father's respectability. Her hands were bound, her eyes hollow with disbelief, and yet, in them, burned a quiet defiance that refused to die. The merchant's daughter who once hosted dinners in satin gloves now stood barefoot before men who called her Lot Number 7. The auctioneer's hammer struck wood. Young, able, obedient, trained in reading and household duties, he declared. The bidders leaned forward, faces hidden beneath umbrellas. Ilara's chest tightened as prices were called like weapons. £20, 25, 30. Each number tore at what remained of her dignity. She tried to keep her gaze low, but curiosity betrayed her. Her eyes caught a figure at the back of the crowd. He stood utterly still amid the noise, cloaked in black, the rain sliding from his shoulders like it feared to touch him. He raised no hand, gave no sign, yet the auctioneer faltered, swallowed hard, and lowered his voice. "We have a new bidder, the Duke of Ravenscar." The crowd gasped. Whispers spread like wind through dry leaves. "The Black Duke, the cursed one. Didn't his wife die in the fire?" Ilara's heart pounded. Every story she had ever heard about him was cruel. A nobleman who lived alone, in a crumbling manor, whose rage had burned his own house, whose servants never smiled again. Why would such a man buy a servant himself? And yet, the hammer fell. "Sold!" As the crowd parted, she glimpsed his face beneath the shadow of his hood, a scar, faint but deep, cutting across a gaze both sharp and tired. When he spoke, his voice was low, textured with restraint. "Bring her to the carriage." He didn't look at her again. 2 footmen took her arms and led her through the rain. Ilara's steps echoed against the cobblestones like the tolling of a bell. Her father's debts had sold her life, but her spirit whispered rebellion with every breath. The carriage was black and old, its emblem a silver raven gleaming through raindrops. Inside, the Duke sat opposite her, silent, his gloved hands resting on a cane carved from obsidian. For a long time, the only sound was the rain drumming against glass. Ilara wanted to speak, to demand why he had bought her, but the weight of his presence pressed the words back into her throat. His voice finally broke the silence. "You needn't fear me if you do your work well." She met his eyes. They were grey, almost colourless, yet deep enough to drown her questions. "And what work is that, Your Grace?" she asked quietly. He turned to the window, his reflection fractured by raindrops. "To keep my house from falling silent." The rest of the journey unfolded in wordless distance. When the carriage finally rolled to a stop before Ravenscar Manor, the air grew colder. The estate loomed like a wounded fortress against the storm, its iron gates creaking open to swallow them whole. Lightning flashed across towers and gargoyles, revealing walls scarred by time and tragedy. As the servants took her luggage, she realized they did not meet her gaze. They moved quickly, whispering under their breath, avoiding the Duke's path. In that moment, Ilara understood. She hadn't merely been sold into service, she had been delivered into legend. Behind those iron gates, the world ended, and another, colder, older, began. Yet even as the heavy doors closed behind her, she whispered a promise beneath her breath, unseen and unheard. "They've sold my freedom, but not my soul." The next morning greeted Ilara not with light, but with grey. Ravenscar Manor seemed to exist in permanent twilight, as though sunlight feared to cross its threshold. The ceilings stretched high enough to swallow echoes, portraits watched from cracked frames, and every corridor whispered secrets that the living dared not repeat. When she was led through the grand hall by a stoic housekeeper, the hush of the place unnerved her more than any scream could have. Dust motes drifted through the air like restless ghosts. Somewhere, far off, a clock ticked too slowly, marking time that no longer mattered. "This wing," said the housekeeper, her voice clipped and careful, "is forbidden to servants." She pointed to a vast set of doors carved with ravens and roses, the Duke's private quarters. "You will clean the library, the music room, and the east corridor. You will not speak to the Duke unless spoken to, and you will never enter the West Hall after dark." Elara nodded silently, though her heart thrummed with questions. She had been a servant only a day, and already mystery coiled around her like a net. The other servants avoided her gaze, moving like shadows through the corridors. Only one, a maid named Lydia, dared whisper, "Be careful, he doesn't like anyone near his rooms. Sometimes we hear him talking to someone who isn't there." That night, unable to sleep, Elara wandered through the dim servants' corridor and found herself before the grand library. The door was ajar, candlelight trembled within. Against her better judgment, she stepped inside. Rows upon rows of books towered to the ceiling, and the scent of old paper wrapped around her like memory. Her fingers brushed a leather spine when a voice, low and thunderous, broke the silence. "You were not summoned." She froze. The Duke stood behind a desk at the far end of the room, half his face caught in the candlelight, the other swallowed by shadow. His dark hair fell across a scar that ran from temple to jaw, a mark of something survived, not inflicted. His eyes were a pale, piercing grey that seemed to weigh every truth she might ever tell. She stammered, lowering her head. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I was only—" "Curious," he finished, his tone neither harsh nor kind. "The library tempts even those who cannot read." "I can read, my lord," she said quietly. That made him look up fully, interest flickering in the emptiness of his gaze. "Can you?" His voice softened, but only slightly. "Then you are already different from most who serve here." The tension hung between them like the stillness before thunder. He gestured toward a nearby chair. "Sit, read." Elara hesitated, unsure whether it was a command or a test. She took the nearest book, a collection of poems by Byron, and began to read aloud. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as the words flowed. "She walks in beauty, like the night." The Duke's expression did not change, yet something behind his stillness shifted, like a door cracking open in a long-abandoned room. When she finished, silence reigned once more. The rain tapped gently against the tall windows. He turned away, dismissing her with a quiet murmur. "Return to your quarters. And Miss Wynne, you may read here again tomorrow, at this hour." It wasn't kindness. It was command cloaked in curiosity. But to Elara it felt like the faintest warmth she had known since her father's death. As she returned to her small chamber under the eaves, she heard the manor creak and sigh around her. Ravenscar was not merely a home, it was a wound that had never healed. Somewhere beyond the locked doors, the Duke carried grief like armor. Yet that night, when Elara closed her eyes, the echo of his voice lingered in her mind, measured, cold, but undeniably human. For the first time since her life had been sold, she felt something unfamiliar stirring within her chest, not fear, but the fragile beginning of hope. Days passed in quiet rhythm, each one melting into the next like candle wax. Elara rose before dawn to scrub marble steps and polish silver, Yet her mind was never on her chores. It was in the library, waiting for the hour when she would read again. The Duke kept his word. Every night at the same hour, a single candle was left burning on the great desk. He never summoned her outright, yet the flicker of that flame was invitation enough. At first, their exchanges were formal. She read, he listened. She never dared to look up for long, for his eyes, though pale, felt like storms in restraint. He would stand by the window, one hand resting on the head of his cane, and listen in stillness so complete it made her heartbeat sound loud. But as the nights lengthened, something began to shift. Sometimes, when she paused mid-sentence, he would quietly finish the line. He knew the words by heart, though he hadn't opened the book himself. One evening, when thunder grumbled above the manor, she read from a story of redemption, a fallen knight forgiven by love. Her voice wavered on the final line, and before she could close the book, he spoke for the first time during their sessions. "Do you believe that?" he asked. She looked up. "Believe what, Your Grace?" "That men like him deserve forgiveness." Her throat tightened. "If they regret what they've done, perhaps they do." A faint, bitter smile crossed his lips. "And what of those who regret what they are?" She hesitated. "I don't believe anyone is beyond saving, my lord." He turned away sharply, as though her gentleness had cut him. The silence that followed was longer than usual. When she finally gathered the courage to rise and leave, his voice stopped her at the door. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "bring something you love to read. Not what you think I should hear." The next night, she chose a simple volume, an old story her mother had read to her as a child, about a girl who tamed a wounded raven. When she began, her voice softened, almost forgetting the grandeur of the room. The Duke didn't stand this time. He sat across from her, his face half lit, listening as if the words themselves could heal him. When she finished, he said nothing. The storm outside had ceased, leaving only the ticking of the old clock. She rose to leave again, but he spoke, barely above a whisper. "Your voice chases away the silence in this house." It was not a compliment, yet it stayed with her long after she returned to her chamber. The other servants noticed the change, how she carried herself more lightly, how her eyes no longer avoided the corridors. Lydia whispered, "Careful, Alara. The Duke breaks what he touches." But Alara had seen something they hadn't. Beneath the layers of fear and solitude, she sensed a man who had once loved deeply and lost completely, a man fighting the ghosts of his own name. A week later, while tending the gardens, she found a wounded raven near the hedge, its wing bent, feathers dark as midnight. She took it to the stables, binding it gently. When the Duke saw her that evening, he noticed the bandage on her hand from the bird's beak. "You tend even to the creatures that would draw your blood," he murmured. "They only bite when they're frightened," she replied softly. For the first time, the Duke looked at her not as a servant, but as something else, something that unsettled him. The lines around his mouth softened, and his voice lost its edge. "You have no idea what you're doing to this house," he said. Alara met his gaze. Then perhaps the house needed it. He didn't answer, but his silence said more than words could. From that night on, she no longer read to him as a servant obeying command, but as a soul reaching toward another through the ruins of grief. She didn't yet know that her voice had become his only light, and that love, silent and forbidden, was already beginning to bloom in the dark corners of Ravenscar Manor. By the end of spring, Ravenscar Manor had changed its rhythm. Once its halls echoed only with silence. Now, Faint traces of music and laughter lingered in the air like ghosts that refused to fade. Servants began to find the Duke less fearsome, his temper shorter, his steps quieter. They whispered that the new servant girl had bewitched him, and though Elara tried to ignore the murmurs, she could feel the stares that followed her like shadows wherever she went. One afternoon, as she carried linens down the corridor, she overheard two maids gossiping near the grand staircase. "She dines in the library now, can you believe it? The Duke never lets anyone near that room. He must have gone mad with loneliness." "Loneliness? Ha! The girl's clever. She knows how to make him forget his station." Elara froze mid-step. Every word cut like glass, but she held her head high, refusing to let the shame show. Still her chest ached as she hurried away. That evening, she entered the library to find the Duke waiting, not standing by the window as usual, but seated, his hands clasped. "You're late," he said, his tone measured. "I was delayed, Your Grace," she replied. "The staff required extra time in the East Wing." He studied her carefully. "They talk, don't they?" Elara hesitated. "They talk about many things." He gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "And yet the noise always finds its way to my ears. They say I've forgotten who I am." She looked up, eyes steady. "And have you?" His gaze held hers. "Perhaps," he said softly. "And perhaps I don't care." For a long moment neither moved. The air between them was taut, trembling with everything unspoken. Elara's heart pounded, not in fear, but in a strange, impossible hope. Then, as if realizing the danger in that stillness, he turned away sharply. "You may go." But the next morning, scandal arrived at the manor in human form. Lady Rowena, the late Duchess's sister, her smile sharp as a blade. She swept through the halls with her parasol like a queen inspecting her fallen kingdom. "Sebastian," she said upon entering the Duke's study, "I hear you've found company." "I have found peace," he replied coolly. "Peace?" she laughed. "With a servant girl? You shame your name." Her words rang through the room, dripping venom. Elara, bringing tea at that very moment, froze at the doorway. Rowena's gaze darted toward her and lingered. "Oh," she said, voice sweet as poison, "so this is the cause of your resurrection?" Elara bowed slightly. "My lady." "Child," Rowena purred, circling her. "Do you even know what happens to girls who climb too high? The fall kills them." Before Elara could speak, the Duke's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Enough." Rowena blinked, shocked by his tone. "You defend her?" "I protect what belongs to my house," he said firmly. "And she does." For the first time since the fire that had destroyed half of Ravenscar, the Duke raised his head before a woman of noble rank and did not bow. Rowena's smile faded. "You've gone mad," she hissed. "A duke cannot love his servant. Society will destroy you both." When she stormed out, silence followed her like a curse. Elara stood trembling, torn between gratitude and dread. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Do you think I fear gossip?" "You should," she said softly. "Because I do." His shoulders fell, the steel in him softening. "Then I will bear it alone." That night, as thunder rolled across the moors, Elara sat awake in her chamber, staring at the rain tracing the window. His words echoed inside her. "I will bear it alone." She had thought herself invisible, a servant lost in the shadows of power, but now she was the flame everyone saw and wanted to extinguish. And still, even knowing that her name was already being whispered through drawing rooms and parlours, she could not stop her heart from whispering his name back into the dark. Summer came to Ravenscar with heat that even the manor's cold stone walls could not contain. Roses climbed the outer walls, heavy and fragrant, spilling over the cracked marble balconies where ivy once grew wild. Yet inside, the air grew heavier each day. The whispers had become more than idle gossip. They were weapons. Letters arrived from neighbouring estates, veiled in polite concern but steeped in judgment. "We hear the Duke of Ravenscar entertains unsuitable company," they read. Some came unsigned, some came from peers who once called him friend. Ilara felt the change before she saw it. Servants began to avoid her entirely. Her meals grew smaller, and the head housekeeper, Mrs. Corbin, no longer met her eyes. The Duke noticed, of course. He noticed everything, but said nothing for days. Then one evening, as they met in the library, he set aside his book before she began reading. "Do you regret coming here?" he asked quietly. Ilara hesitated. "Regret does not free the caged, my lord. It only reminds them they once could fly." Something inside him faltered. "You think yourself caged?" She smiled faintly. "I think we both are." He looked down at his gloved hands. "Perhaps you're right, but I chose my prison, and I was sold into mine." The words slipped out before she could stop them. The silence that followed was long and terrible. Finally he rose and turned toward the window, his reflection fractured in the glass. "No one should ever own you again, Ilara." Before she could ask what he meant, a carriage arrived outside. Through the rain-specked window, she saw a familiar crest, Lord Hemsworth, the very creditor who had bought her father's debt. Her breath caught. Moments later, the butler entered, pale and trembling. "My lord, Lord Hemsworth, insists upon an audience." "Send him in," the Duke said, his voice iron. Hemsworth entered with a swaggering grin, his gloved hand tapping a folded parchment against his thigh. "Your Grace," he drawled, "forgive the intrusion. I've come to collect what's mine." Ilara froze as he unfolded the paper, the very debt contract that had condemned her. "This girl," Hemsworth said, "was never freed from her obligation. Technically, she's still mine. And as of this moment, I'm reclaiming her." The Duke's eyes turned to steel. "You mistake the law for morality," he said. Hemsworth sneered. "Morality doesn't pay debts." In one smooth motion, the Duke tore the parchment in half, the sound like a blade through silence. "Then consider the debt repaid." He threw a pouch of gold onto the table. "Twice the value." But Ilara's voice stopped them both. "No!" She stepped forward, trembling. "I will not be bought again, not by anyone." Both men turned toward her. Her voice shook, but her eyes blazed. "I came to your house as a servant, Your Grace, not a possession. If I am to stay, it will not be because you paid for me." For the first time in years, Sebastian Ashbourne, once called the Black Duke, had no words. His hand tightened around his cane. The silence stretched until it ached. Then quietly he said, "You are free, Ilara Wynne. If you wish to leave, no man will stop you, not even I." Tears stung her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "Freedom means little if it leaves behind what you love," she whispered. Hemsworth's laughter cracked through the air. "Touching, but she'll starve without your coin." Ilara turned to him, her voice steady. "I've starved before. I survived then, and I will again." She left that night, her footsteps echoing down the long marble hall like fading heartbeat. The Duke stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching the door close behind her. For a long time, he said nothing. But when he turned back toward the library, he did something no one at Ravenscar had ever seen. He fell to his knees and pressed his hand to the cold marble floor, whispering a name, not in command, but in prayer. Outside, the storm broke. Rain lashed the windows, and somewhere a wounded raven took flight into the night. Ravenscar Manor had always been quiet, but now it was silent. It had been weeks since Ilara's departure, and the house no longer breathed. The air hung heavy with dust, no laughter echoed through the halls, no music touched the old piano. The servants moved like shadows, speaking in hushed tones as though the very walls might shatter beneath the weight of their master's grief. The Duke no longer visited the library. The single candle that had once burned each night, his unspoken invitation, remained dark. He spent his evenings alone in the study, surrounded by unopened letters and empty decanters. In the mornings, he would walk the east gardens where Ilara once tended the roses, tracing the paths she had taken with hands clasped tightly behind his back. "She's gone, my lord," said Mrs. Corbin one morning, the courage in her voice brittle. "She's gone where servants belong. Let it be." But Sebastian only looked out the window, his reflection fading in the fog. "Servants belong nowhere," he murmured, but she was never a servant. In her absence, the manor began to decay. The rose vines turned brown, the air grew colder, and even the ravens that had perched faithfully on the towers abandoned their posts. It was as if the house itself mourned. Yet the Duke, for all his wealth and titles, did nothing to stop it. Grief had numbed him into stillness, until one night. It was raining again, the same merciless storm that had first carried Ilara to his gate. He sat in the library staring at the unlit fireplace when he noticed something glinting beneath the desk, a small piece of folded parchment. He reached for it, fingers trembling, and recognized her handwriting. It was the last note she had left him before she went, tucked between the pages of a book she'd once read aloud. "Do not forget that kindness is not weakness. You taught me that. Farewell." For a long time, he simply stared at the note. Then he rose, something awakening inside him like an old wound, reopening. He went to the stables, called for his horse, and ignored every plea from his servants. "Where are you going, my lord?" the butler asked, his voice quivering. "To find what I should never have let go." He rode through the night, the wind tearing at his cloak, the thunder chasing him across the moors. For the first time in years, he was not the feared Duke of Ravenscar. He was just a man chasing hope. At dawn, he reached the outskirts of London, where the city's noise swallowed the moorland's silence. He searched through the servant quarters, the workhouses, even the old auction yard where he'd first seen her. But she was nowhere. Only one man recognized her name. "Ilara Wynne?" the innkeeper said. "A quiet one. She's been working as a tutor for a merchant's children in Bloomsbury." The Duke's heart clenched. He thanked the man and turned his horse toward the address. When he reached the modest townhouse, he saw her through the window, seated at a small desk, reading to two little children. She wore a plain blue dress, her hair unadorned, her face calm. For a long while he simply watched, afraid to breathe, afraid to break the fragile peace she had built. Then the children ran off, leaving her alone. She turned toward the window and saw him. Her eyes widened, shock melting into disbelief. She stepped outside, the morning rain catching her hair like silver threads. "My lord," she breathed, "why are you here?" He dismounted slowly, the years of pride falling away with each step. "Because I've built a kingdom of walls and none of them kept you from leaving." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "You shouldn't have come." "Perhaps not," he said softly. but I cannot live in silence anymore. You taught me how to hear again. The street was quiet, save for the rain whispering against the stones, and though he didn't kneel, not yet, his voice carried the weight of surrender. If you wish me gone, I'll go, but if you still believe no one is beyond saving, let me try. Ilara looked at him, the fear and anger fading, replaced by the same ache that had lived in both of them for far too long. You can't buy forgiveness, Sebastian. I'm not offering gold, he said, voice trembling. I'm offering myself. She closed her eyes, torn between the world she had built and the one she had left behind. When she opened